This is a story about the summer that changed everything. It begins in a quiet, isolated town called Juniper Valley, a place where everyone knows each other and life moves at a steady, predictable pace. But beneath the stillness of its hills and the dark waters of Lake Colette, something ancient and unexplainable was stirring. What began with strange cats wandering the streets turned into something far darker, something monstrous. And at the center of it all was Jane Catornis, a woman whose connection to these creatures was as unsettling as the creatures themselves. What I witnessed that summer defied all logic, science, and reason. It forced me to question everything I knew about the natural world and about survival. To this day, I don't have all the answers. But I know one thing for sure. Not everything that looks human or even remotely alive is safe. And sometimes, the things we fear the most are the ones hiding in plain sight. They put up a tall fence around Lake Colette, right in the middle of Juniper Valley. It was covered with black tarp and topped with barbed wire, making it impossible for anyone to see what was going on inside. 2 of our 3 local cop cars were parked at either end of the lake around the clock. One on the east side, one on the west. For 3 days, some mysterious organization worked on whatever they were doing inside. And then, overnight, everything changed. The black barbed wire fence disappeared, replaced by a normal chain link one. A group of middle school kids dared Kevin Witter to sneak in with a pair of wire cutters. My little half-brother knew Kevin, and Kevin had all sorts of wild stories about what was going on. According to him, he saw unmarked vans and a bunch of government agents in sunglasses carrying automatic weapons. There were scientists in hazmat suits too, dragging a monster's carcass out of the lake. The monster, according to Kevin, had 10 legs, skin like an alligator, and a body that shifted between being like a squid or a shark, or even covered in matted fur, feathers, or rows of teeth. Of course, the story changed every time Kevin told it, and it was clear he was full of crap. I don't think he even got near the fence. He either chickened out or got caught by the cops before he had a chance to do anything. When the 3 days were over, some early risers in town claimed they saw unmarked cars heading east down Skylark Road toward the highway, the Air Force Base, or maybe the Palmdale Airport. By sunrise, whoever had been working behind the fence had vanished without a trace. No one ever told us what they were doing or what they found. The cops didn't know, or maybe they just pretended not to. All they told us was that a bacterial infestation had been found in the lake, and that swimming there was off limits until further notice. But I'll never swim in Lake Colette again. Whatever they found, I hope to God they killed all of it. That summer, I was staying in Juniper Valley with my dad. He and my stepmom loved living there, embracing the isolation and small-town lifestyle. Though calling Juniper Valley a town was a bit of a stretch. It wasn't even incorporated, just a scattered cluster of ranch-style homes nestled in the Sierra Pelona Mountains. Back in the 90s, the population was around 800. There was one general store, one gas station, one church, and a run-down little inn that also had a bar and restaurant. If you needed anything else, you had to drive 45 minutes to Palmdale, through miles of flat, golden land, lined with power lines, silos, and rusting scrap metal. Juniper Valley was like a bowl, with Lake Colette sitting at the center. The streets and houses were arranged around the edges of the bowl, climbing up the surrounding hills. Calling it a lake was a bit generous too. It was really just a sag pond, sitting right on the San Andreas Fault. During droughts, it dried up until it was just a marshy puddle filled with waist-high weeds. But there were rainy years when the lake stayed full, even through the hot summers. I used to stare at it from my bedroom window at night. Under the dim light of the 2 street lamps on Skylark Road, it looked like a black pit, pitch dark, like a tar pit or a bottomless well. On moonless nights, it felt like it could swallow me whole. As I got older, spending summers in Juniper Valley became mind-numbingly boring. My dad and stepmom worked all day. My half-siblings went to summer school, and all my friends were 70 miles away. The nearest library was just as far, and our TV only picked up 3 channels: local access from Palmdale, a religious channel, and non-stop infomercials. It was my step-grandmother who introduced me to the Wilfell Animal Sanctuary. She went to church with Kathy, the retired park ranger who ran the sanctuary. Wilfell was a nonprofit that survived on donations and volunteers. Kathy owned an acre of hillside off Skylark Road, just west of town, about a 15-minute walk from my dad's house. I was 13 the first summer I volunteered there, and after that, it became a tradition. Kathy and the small team there loved having me. By team, I mean Kathy herself, an earthy woman in her 60s who handled everything from management to animal care, and Jacques, a 27-year-old autistic man who cleaned cages and walked dogs through a government-subsidized program. And then there were the animals. I fell in love with them. The sanctuary housed about 60 of them, homeless dogs and unwanted cats mostly. Kathy's large backyard had 2 massive kennels, one for dogs, one for cats. Behind that, there were rabbit hutches, and further back, a tiny stable that held an elderly racehorse and a chubby little donkey. When Pounds in Palmdale and Lancaster couldn't take in more animals, they turned to Kathy. She'd hop into her rickety old windowless van, drive east toward the highway, and come back hours later with a new load of furry charges. Sometimes she even acted as an unofficial dog catcher. Animal control agencies would call her to remove starving, mangy dogs from backyards or rescue emaciated cats hiding under cars. These were the highway strays, abandoned by careless owners along Route 14. That summer, I met Jane Catornes. Jane was a friend of Kathy's, a retired Navy nurse who worked as an at-home caregiver and took in homeless cats. She visited Wilfell Animal Sanctuary at least once a week, often bringing large bags of cat food. Jane wasn't like most people. She was tanned and wiry, her skin wrinkled far beyond her years. She always wore stained wife-beaters and baggy fatigues. She'd never married, had no family I knew of, and seemed to prefer the company of cats over humans. Kathy appreciated her for that. Jane was always willing to take in 20 cats at a time when the sanctuary had no more room. Jane lived on a half-acre of land off Oak Tree Lane, a shabby 2-lane road southwest of town. The road snaked through gray-green hills before dead-ending deep in the Angeles National Forest. Old, rusting mailboxes marked dirt roads that led to scattered ranches, groves, and campgrounds. Her cottage sat at the end of one of those dirt paths, in a small clearing overrun with knee-high weeds and prickly shrubs. Gently sloping hills surrounded the house on 3 sides. Sometimes Jane would take me there, and I'd find myself surrounded by cats, inside, outside, everywhere. There were cats on the sofa, perched on the washer, sunning themselves, stalking mice, and chasing butterflies. They were sleeping, fighting, or mating. I spent hours at Jane's house, helping her clean up, change litter boxes, and cuddle kittens from the occasional litter. Jane liked me, and that felt special. She wasn't the kind of person who needed people around, so when she smiled at me, it felt like the highest compliment. Every summer, the first time she saw me, her face would light up with a smile that Kathy swore she saved just for me. "You're like me, Marlena," Jane once told me as I stared out the window of her beat-up El Camino. "You can cut through anyone's bullshit and see their soul. That's why you love animals so much. Your standards for souls are higher than most." The earthquake came during the winter of my junior year. I woke up in the middle of the night to the thud of my math book falling off my desk. The mild shaking only lasted a few seconds. Once I realized it was an earthquake, I rolled over and went back to sleep. Juniper Valley didn't get off so easy. Sitting on the San Andreas Fault and closer to the epicenter, the area suffered extensive damage. Heavy rains that winter caused mudslides, closing roads, and isolating remote homes. By summer, most of the mess had been cleaned up, but Skylark Road still bore fresh cracks, and broken sandbag barricades lined the streets. Lake Colette was fuller than I'd ever seen it, but the water had turned a sickly green. Thick yellow scum floated in clumps across the surface. A chain-link fence surrounded the lake now, and it was officially closed to the public. When I returned to Wilfell that summer, I had my driver's license, which earned me a new responsibility, driving Kathy's old van. The thing was still miraculously running, but Kathy was sick of driving it all over the valley. I loved it at first. Driving through Golden Plains, heading toward Palmdale or Lancaster, felt freeing. I'd rescue filthy, unloved animals from neglectful owners or apathetic bureaucrats. It felt like I was making a difference. Jane, though, had all but disappeared. Her last nursing charge had passed away, and she was rarely seen around town anymore. Only at the general store, according to Kathy. And even that wasn't often. It felt like Kathy and I were the only ones in Juniper Valley who noticed she was gone. I missed her. I missed her warm smile and the quiet afternoons spent surrounded by her cats. I even tried calling her landline once, but it had been disconnected. And then the cats started showing up. On my third day back, I was sitting in Kathy's office when the phone rang. It was a talkative old lady from town. She told me there was a cat sitting in the branches of her oak tree. "I think it's someone's pet," she said. "It's too chubby to be a stray." Calls like this weren't unusual. Everyone in town knew about Kathy's shelter and called her instead of animal control when an animal became a nuisance. Most of the time, it was a neighbor's lost pet or a runaway from Palmdale. Occasionally, a stray would make it all the way to Juniper Valley, but those animals were usually half dead. Mange, pustules, and infections were common, and most of them didn't survive long enough to make it to the vet. This cat, though, was different. When I arrived, I found a calm, well-groomed gray and white shorthair perched in the oak tree. It didn't look like a stray at all. I tried coaxing it down with a can of tuna, but it didn't even glance at the food. Instead, it stared at something, or nothing, beyond me, its black, bottomless eyes locked on something invisible. I felt ridiculous standing there, holding out a can of tuna for 5 minutes. Finally, I gave up and went back to the van to grab Kathy's net. When I returned, the cat was gone. It bothered me all night. The way it stared, it felt like it had been toying with me, and then it kept happening, again and again. Homeowner after homeowner in Juniper Valley called Wilfell to report a cat on their property. Always cats, always different ones. I don't think I ever saw the same one twice. Each caller swore they had never seen the animal before, and none of the cats wore collars. Yet every single one looked well-fed, some even overweight, with thick, intact fur. They were nothing like strays. It started to bother me. Juniper Valley was small, with a population of just 842. The town sat 45 minutes from the nearest city and was surrounded on 3 sides by forest and hills. Everyone knew each other, and their pets. But suddenly, there were all these cats that no one could account for. And these weren't ordinary cats. They seemed to like water. I'd find them lounging in fountains or sitting in kiddie pools. They avoided sunlight, coming out only at night or hiding in dark, shaded spots. They were eerily silent. No meowing, no hissing, not even a soft purr. They had a knack for getting in and out of places. I once found one curled up in the back seat of a woman's car. She admitted she'd left the door unlocked, but the act of opening and closing the door seemed impossible for an animal with just paws. They were smart, too smart. At times, I felt like they were taunting me. Whenever I tried to catch one, the cat would just sit there, watching me, calm and composed. I'd start to believe I might actually succeed, and then, just like that, it would dart out of reach. Sometimes they disappeared the moment I glanced away. And the creepiest part? Once or twice after slipping away, a cat would stop and look back at me. I could have sworn it was laughing. Their eyes were the worst. All of them shared the same icy, emotionless black eyes that reminded me too much of the empty stares from the euthanized corpses I'd seen at Wilfell. Finally, I managed to catch one. It was early July. I'd hatched a plan I thought was clever. I bought a large plastic storage tub from the general store, filled it with water, and placed it in the back of the van. Then I waited. After an hour of hiding in the cab, the cat I'd been after, a chubby, pug-faced tabby, climbed down from the roof of the van and stepped right into the makeshift reservoir. I rushed out, slammed the van door shut, slipped on leather gloves, and prepared for a fight. But the cat didn't resist. It was fully submerged in the water, curled up at the bottom of the tub like a rock. Puzzled but determined, I scooped it up, shoved it into a cage, dumped the water, and started driving back to Willfell. Halfway there, I noticed the smell. It was awful, like rotting fish. It reminded me of the time my son had dropped a fish stick in the back seat of my car and forgotten about it. A humid summer week later, the stench had been unbearable, just like the cat smelled now. When we arrived, the tabby still didn't put up a fight. I didn't hold it for long. Experience had taught me not to risk claws near my face for longer than necessary. But the short time I did hold it was unsettling. The cat felt heavy, almost doughy. My hand sank into its flesh like it was made of putty, and it was cold. I left it in the quarantine cage in Kathy's office. Normally, we only use that cage for sick animals. But something about this cat felt wrong. I didn't want it near the others. I gave it food and water and sat down to work on a grant application, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder. Each time, the cat was exactly the same, sitting in its water bowl, staring at me. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. The room reeked of that rotting, fishy odor. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I double-checked the cage latch, locked the office door, and busied myself with the dogs. I even called the vet to ask him to come by, but he couldn't make it for another week. The next morning, the office window was wide open, the quarantine cage was empty, and the cat was gone. I wasn't upset. If anything, I was relieved. But things only got stranger after that. Soon, everyone in town was talking about Charlie Henderson. Charlie was 12 and had been skateboarding alone late one night in the parking lot near Lake Colette. The lake was still fenced off, covered in scum and surrounded by dark, empty houses. According to Charlie, a cat approached him while he was skating. It was friendly, so he bent down to pet it. But the cat darted away, pausing to look back at him before disappearing into the trees behind the lake. Curious, Charlie followed. He followed the cat. But then, out of nowhere, a swarm of cats attacked him. They jumped from trees, darted from shadows, and latched onto his clothing and limbs, dragging him toward a hole in the fence. If not for a lost car pulling into the parking lot and turning around, scaring the cats away and giving Charlie a chance to escape, who knows what they would have done to him? No one believed his story, of course. People figured he'd been scratched by a single feral cat and let his imagination run wild. After all, cats don't organize and attack people. That kind of behavior takes planning and intelligence far beyond that of a normal house cat. But Charlie's tale was even stranger. He swore that one of the cats stretched itself unnaturally, like silly putty, and grew an opposable thumb. And then Jane came back. It was a cloudy afternoon, and I was using the cooler weather as an opportunity to deep clean the dog kennel. Kathy was away again, this time in Riverside, to watch her granddaughter's softball game. I was scraping dried dog mess off the concrete when Jacques ran out, breathless, to tell me someone was asking for me. I wiped my hands clean and headed inside, where I found Jane Catornes standing in Kathy's living room. Jane had always been rough around the edges, but now she looked like a completely different person. If I hadn't known her so well, I might have mistaken her for a homeless woman. Her wiry gray hair was a tangled mess. Her wife beater stained and rumpled. Her arms and chest were covered in scratches and cuts, some fresh, others older, all in various stages of healing. And her eyes, they weren't the sharp, calculating eyes I remembered. They were bloodshot and wild, filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Jane!" I exclaimed, startled. "What? Are you okay?" She didn't respond with her usual smile. Instead, she stared at me with a blank, trembling expression. "Do you have any?" she asked abruptly. "Any what?" I frowned, confused. "Cats, Marlena," she said sharply. "It's the cats. I need the cats. They've been wandering." I hesitated, forcing a polite smile. "Sure, Jane, I can show you the cats. But Kathy said I'm not allowed to adopt any of them out while she's gone." That was a lie. I could have handed over every cat in the sanctuary if I wanted to, but there was no way I was letting Jane take one in her condition. She wasn't fit to care for herself, let alone a living creature. I led her to the cat kennel. As we walked past the dogs, they came bounding over to greet her, tails wagging. But then, something strange happened. About 3 feet away from her, the dogs froze. They sniffed the air, let out uneasy whines, and backed away. One by one, they loped off in different directions, as if they wanted nothing to do with her. Jane didn't even seem to notice. She inspected the cats in the kennel with a critical eye, but after a moment she sighed in disappointment. "You haven't caught any," she muttered. "Caught any what?" I asked, unsure of what she meant. She turned to glare at me, her bloodshot eyes piercing through me as if she could see something I couldn't. "You know what I mean, Marlena. My cats. Call me if you catch one. There's so many of them now, and they're getting bigger." With that, she turned and walked away. At the door, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and added, "And Marlena? Watch the lake." I spent the rest of the day in a haze, her words circling in my mind. I'd been wondering about the strange cats myself, where they came from, who they belonged to. No one in Juniper Valley had claimed them, and it seemed unlikely that they'd traveled all the way from Palmdale. Jane had always taken in homeless cats. Maybe they were hers. But why would they leave the safety of her home, food, water, and shelter, to wander miles down a desolate road and into our neighborhood? It didn't make sense, but at least it was a possibility. That night, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I borrowed my father's car and drove to the parking lot by Lake Colette, the same place where Charlie Henderson had been attacked. Something about Jane's words, "Watch the lake," had lodged itself in my mind. So I parked right by the fence, turned off the engine, and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. I obeyed her. I watched the lake. I hadn't been sitting there for 10 minutes when I saw movement. A black shape crept out of the shadows and approached the water's edge. Then I noticed more movement, this time near a cluster of trees to my right. I opened the car door cautiously and stepped out as quietly as possible. Gently closing the door, I tiptoed toward the fence. At the water's edge, a large black cat waded into the filthy lake. Its paws disappeared beneath the surface, and it kept going, moving deeper into the water. A soft creak of metal drew my attention to the right. I turned my head and saw them. 2 more cats. Massive ones. The biggest I'd ever seen. They were climbing down the fence headfirst, like monkeys, their movements unnervingly fluid. One, a yellow cat, jumped gracefully to the ground. The other, a tabby, followed, stepping into the faint light cast by the street lamps. The black cat was now almost completely submerged. With a faint gurgle, it dipped below the scum-covered surface of the water. It disappeared into the darkness of the lake, a tar pit with teeth. The light from the street lamps wasn't good, but it was enough to make me uneasy. As the yellow and tabby cats landed, it looked as though they flattened. Their bodies seemed to squish like Play-Doh thrown against a wall. And the way they moved, jiggling, their legs bending unnaturally, was deeply unsettling. Maybe it was just the poor lighting, I told myself. But where had the black cat gone? It couldn't still be underwater. Could it? The lake rippled. Small islands of yellow scum shifted with gentle waves. I felt no breeze. Something was moving in there. Something I couldn't see. Suddenly, a chill ran through me. A long-forgotten fear was triggered in my brain, something I hadn't felt since I was a child, staring at Lake Colette from my bedroom window. Back then, it had seemed like a bottomless well that could swallow me whole. Panic overtook me, and I sprinted back to the car. I started the engine, spun the tires in the dirt, and tore out of the parking lot, speeding home as fast as I could. The next morning, under the bright sun and clear skies, it all felt absurd. I was letting Charlie Henderson's wild story and my own imagination get the better of me. I walked past Lake Colette on my way to Wilfell. The fence looked the same as always, and the lake, though scum-covered and green, appeared normal. A light breeze ruffled the surface of the water. Then the smell hit me. I gagged. It was the same sickening odor I'd noticed on the pug-faced tabby I'd caught, a mix of rotting fish and the foul stench of a fast food dumpster baking in the sun. As I stared at the lake, something clicked. Cats don't like water. Cats don't swim. I'd spent years surrounded by cats, and these weren't like any I'd ever known. The smell, the way the tabby had felt in my hands, bloated, putty-like, cold, the way these cats didn't meow or purr, didn't eat or poop, their intelligence. Those glassy, corpse-like eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. And then there was Jane. My cats, she'd said, that they're getting bigger. What had she meant? Why had she been covered in scratches? Her own cats had been attacking her, and yet she was desperate to have them back. I had to talk to her again. Kathy was still away, and Jacques had the day off, so I planned to visit Jane after I finished feeding the animals. But just as I was about to leave, a family from Palmdale called, asking if they could come by with their daughter to adopt a dog. By the time they'd chosen a corgi mix and arranged for its neutering, it was after 5 p.m. Still, there was daylight left. I locked up the sanctuary, grabbed the van keys, and headed toward Jane's remote home. Driving up Oak Tree Lane, my confidence began to waver. The farther I went, the lonelier the road became. Civilization shrank in my rearview mirror until it was just me and the desolate hills. I didn't see another car the entire way. Finally, I reached the rusted blue mailbox with Jane's house number. I turned onto the dirt road, the van jostling violently as I climbed the hill. At the top, her shack came into view, a tiny structure nestled in a secluded valley. There were no lights on inside the house, and the yard was eerily empty. I pulled into the driveway past the house and parked near the carport in the back. The rear door of the house was wide open, and Jane's El Camino sat parked beneath the carport. But there were no cats. No cats lounging on the porch or prowling the yard. I'd never been near Jane's house without seeing at least a few. The silence was deafening. I stepped out of the van and wandered into the backyard. The property looked beautiful in the fading light, surrounded by golden hills and trees, silhouetted against the evening sky. For a moment, I forgot my unease. That's when it happened. She must have been hiding in the house. She must have crept up behind me, because I don't remember the blow. I woke up lying in cool, damp dirt, staring at water. A pond? No. It wasn't Lake Colette. There were hills and trees in the distance. Where the hell was I? I sat up, my head spinning. Blood matted my hair. I was on the bank of a small pond, its surface thick with algae and yellow scum. The stench was unbearable. Rotting fish, decaying flesh, the sour tang of garbage, stronger than anything I'd ever smelled. The water rippled. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something was coming toward me. A black cat emerged, paddling awkwardly with disturbingly human-like strokes. Panic surged, and I scrambled backward as the creature reached the shore. It pulled itself onto the bank, then stood up. And it wasn't a cat anymore. Its body shifted, bulging and warping like a stress ball being squeezed. Its legs thickened and shortened, and its skin seemed to jiggle as it moved. It wasn't a creature of muscle and bone, it was something else entirely. Something soft and gelatinous, wearing a furry disguise. I screamed and stumbled to my feet, but icy fingers clamped around my neck from behind. Struggling, I managed to kick backward, breaking free. I whirled around. I was face to face with Jane. Or what had once been Jane.